Hello, and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide, baby. This Valentine's Day, I thought we could take a look at Azeroth's hottest new couple, Regent Lord Lor'themar and First Arcanist Thalyssra, and why I really don't like them together. Yeah, sorry, I don't. My opinions on the Blood Elf racial leader, Lor'themar and the Nightborn racial leader, Thalyssra, are pretty similar to one another. I think they are both perfectly adequate. Lor'themar famously received little spotlight after his introduction until Mists of Pandaria, and then again until Battle for Azeroth. There wasn't much to dislike about the guy, but he never had the aura of someone like Kael'thas Sunstrider. As for Thalyssra, she was very enjoyable during the Suramar campaign, particularly while she was still withered, though she did feel like a character better suited for a rebellion story than what came after, and her aide, Val'Tra, seemed to embody the Nightborn race better than she did. In recent years, it feels like Blizzard has leaned heavily into the pairing of these two, exposing us to their relationship much more than one would expect from WoW's style of writing. And personally, I don't much care for it. Honestly, Warcraft rarely writes its couples in a way that I enjoy. The two main exceptions to that are Sylvanas and Nathanos, who I know most people don't care for, and Rico and Kirin, who are more of a joke relationship between very minor characters. But this particular ship grinds my gears more than normal. In this video, I will give a brief summary of their history together, and then break down why I don't support them. Lor'themar and Thalyssra first met one another in the lead up to Battle for Azeroth. When Sylvanas called for new allies for the Horde, Liadrin, who had led the Horde forces in the Suramar campaign, suggested the Nightborn, whom the Blood Elves had fostered an amicable relationship with. As part of this recruitment effort, Thalyssra is invited to Silvermoon to learn more of the Horde on their turf. She and Lor'themar are cordial, though friendly, working together to protect the Sunwell from Void forces. The two would maintain a correspondence thereafter, and were both present when the Horde and Alliance fleets were caught up in the opening of Nazjatar. The two would work together in leading the Horde forces in the fight against Ajara. Both of them were also present for Sourfang's rebellion, where they stood against Sylvanas. After the defeat of N'Zoth, Horde leadership decided to do away with the Warchief position in lieu of a council, and in the flavor scenes afterwards, we discovered that Thalyssra has been pushing for Lor'themar to visit Suramar, even conspiring with Haldoran and Romoth to get him there. This exact interaction is shown to us in intimate detail in the short story, A Moment in Verse. Lor'themar makes his visit to the Nightborn city and participates along with Thalyssra in a poetry competition, one which seems to last all of 3 minutes and 2 poems before Thalyssra calls for a 2-hour break. I'm not really into poetry. Is that how poetry slams usually work? Anyway, the two engage in some emotional discussion, Thalyssra bidding Lor'themar to set aside the weight of his duties during the visit, and the story concludes with the two of them kissing. The two are occasionally shown together thereafter in-game, with the spotlight returning to them in another short story, The Vow Eternal. This one follows Wrathion as he struggles with the anxiety of following in his father's footsteps, and how the world perceives him. The bulk of the story takes place at Thalyssra and Lor'themar's wedding. Fortunately, as Wrathion is the narrator, we're permitted a less flowery take on everything, and he expresses his inner annoyance at having to even attend a wedding, a frustration I'm sure many of us introverts can relate to. The couple exchanges their vows, and later have to deal with the intrusion of Kurag Grimtotem, whose spat with Wrathion leads to their cake being destroyed. Wrathion then takes his leave to later be approached by Kalik. The two realize something is amiss with Dragonkind, and upon confronting Alexstrasza in Dragonblight, learn that it is a homesickness triggered by the Dragon Isle's awakening. Lor'themar and Thalyssra are given focus again as the narrative through-line of exploring Azeroth islands and isles, the premise of which is the two of them attempting to find a suitable location for their belated honeymoon while on said honeymoon. The two get a bit heated with one another and decide to part ways while continuing their search, eventually reconvening on the Dragon Isles, where they determine that the location of their honeymoon is not nearly as important as simply being together. So then, why does this pairing get under my skin so much? Firstly, and perhaps this is a trivial thing to get worked up about, but I'm not overly fond of racial leaders being paired up like this. It feels almost fanficky that for two populations presumably numbering in the thousands upon thousands, that the two leaders of those populations would get together. This kind of thing certainly can make a lot of sense in fiction, but usually within the context of a political marriage, something meant to tie two kingdoms together. That's just not really a thing in WoW. So instead, it feels more like someone just took the two most important and attractive elves they could find and smushed them together because it'd be hot. To be clear, I'm not against racial leaders having romantic lives or even having romances with other races. Obviously, I support Sylvanas and Nathanos,
and I'm mostly kind of okay with Turalyon and Ilaria, though that one's a bit iffy because they both overshadow the supposed Lightforged Draenei and Void Elf racial leaders, Faria and Umbric. But you may be asking, why does it even really matter? Well, the stories of races in WoW are very often told through their leaders. Them being an item means that any story involving Lor'themar and the Blood Elves is very likely to involve Thalyssra and the Nightborn. Any story involving Thalyssra and the Nightborn is very likely to involve Lor'themar and the Blood Elves. It makes the two races less distinct from one another, and especially in modern WoW, racial identity is facing constant erosion to the point that it's almost literally just a cosmetic thing. I said in my Allied Races video that despite my love for Nightborn and my main being a Nightborn, I don't necessarily think they should have become a playable race, because they were so similar to Blood Elves and it would be difficult to keep them unique. At any rate, if you really wanted to write a romance for one of them, other options were available. Liadrin, for example, had a much more involved role in the Nightborn Rebellion and revitalization prior to the Allied Race unlock quests. My second gripe with it is that it feels like the relationship reduces them as characters instead of adding to them. This is a risk when writing any couple in any story, to be fair. If you're not careful, then they start to become characterized more by the relationship than by who they are as individuals. And I definitely feel that has happened so far in this case. Since the tease in 8.3, there have been scarcely any content for either character that did not focus on them as a couple. Aside from very token appearances, it's been their poetry date, their wedding, and their honeymoon. Of course, it makes sense to focus on them being together a bit right now, and it isn't too late to individualize them again. But it is a trend I noticed. Heck, I would caution people against letting this happen to them in real life as well. You often hear about how members of a couple start to act more and more like one another, how people change after getting into a relationship, and how they can become neglectful of friendships and other areas of their life that were once important to them. Simply put, don't lose sight of who you are as an individual. And my third problem with it all is just that it's overly saccharine. This point boils down entirely to flavor and personal preference, and I'm really not meaning to throw shade at any of the authors involved, but the dialogue between these two characters and the prose surrounding them is entirely too flowery and goopy for my taste. I prefer reading about couples whose dynamic is either more buddy-like if I want realism, or more adversarial if I want entertainment. But entirely too much of what I see with these two is them waxing poetic about how much they mean to one another, or Lor'themar musing about her incomparable beauty. And Thalyssra's profound ability to banish away the anxieties that plague his mind also flirts close to the concept of the magical other, a special someone who, once we find them, will almost transcendentally bring harmony and completeness to our life. A misguided concept which is wildly inaccurate to reality. Now again, I have to be fair and admit that I have not personally read the Exploring Azeroth series, where the two of them actually have a tiff, so maybe it's not as bad as I think. But from what I have seen, it reminds me a bit too much of Hallmark Channel rom-coms, and it makes me gag just a little bit. So that's why I haven't relished the union of these two characters the way most other players who care about this stuff seem to have. To me, they as a couple pose a narrative risk to both the Sin'dorei and the Shaldorei. They feel like less than the sum of their parts, and they're just too sweet. But I don't want this video to be entirely negative, so I will point out one thing that I really appreciate about the pairing. As far as it's been presented to us, the two of them have continued carrying out their duties as the leaders of their peoples, and are doing so as they did before, from Silvermoon and Suramar. Here, we have a couple that is healthy and functioning while living far apart and supposedly having little personal time. And I think that's wonderful. I feel that even nowadays, people have far too narrow of a view of what it means to be in a couple or what a marriage has to look like. It doesn't have to just be two people living together doing cliche couple things. A relationship can function however the people involved in it want it to. The only requirement is love, baby. Screw all the haters that try to tell you you're doing it wrong. So, for that, I do applaud Lor'thelyssra. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Thalyssra because between the two of them, she is my favorite, and she's my racial leader, so I would hope so. As I stated earlier, I did find her a bit more compelling when she was still withered and leading the rebellion to retake Suramar from Elisand and the Legion, and that she has been a bit less interesting since then, but I still think there's a lot of potential for her, and I look forward to seeing storylines involving her and not involving Lor'themar. and same goes to him. I do think she has an appealing character design, pretty much all Nightborn do, and they also all have really cool weapons and armor, Thalyssra's staff being particularly cool. Speaking more generally, I just love how elves in WoW all have really long ears and really long eyebrows, as well as chompies that harken back to their troll heritage, which unfortunately often get forgotten even in official Blizzard media. So I was trying very hard to remember to include them here before realizing, oh yeah, you only really see them when their mouth is open. But even so, here's my PSA to all WoW fan artists out there. Remember the elf chompies. And I chose to depict her inside the Nighthold raid, just relaxing by that very memorable fountain in the middle of the city that Spellblade Eluriel would constantly patrol around. Man, the Nighthold was such a good raid. Probably top 5 in WoW's history, definitely top 10. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.